my first selection will be Julie Andrews singing The Sound of No. Trust me, you're much better off for that. Hope you're all doing well this afternoon. I would once again like to welcome you all here. This will be my second and unfortunately last lecture on the cruise. I'm getting off in Shanghai. So you will have a good friend of mine by the name of Shelby Coffey, who I believe will be coming on board. Shelby and I are old friends, and I think you'll really enjoy his work and give him help what he deserves. That'll teach. Dr. Mary Lee Coffey will be along, and she will be here to take care of any of your coughs. Not that anybody has any coughs here, I assure you, but I had a little tickle in my throat. Went to a great pharmacist in Hong Kong. His name was Dr. No. Gave me a lovely formula. It's sort of green. It glows a little bit in the dark. And as a consequence of that, I couldn't quite figure out the ingredients to it. There's something about U-238. I'm sure it'll work. I'm not a problem. I have a glowing feeling throughout the whole thing. Well, listen, I also want to welcome today my wife of 34 years. I think I'd mentioned this before to you. She served in CIA for that period of time. She's quietly sitting off in the corner over here. Not only as someone who recruited spies for a living, one of the first women to do that, but also someone who was a spy catcher. So anyway, Suzanne, thank you for your service as well. Why don't we give her a moment of applause if you don't mind? Thank you. For two reasons. Number one is I love her, and number two is before we left our home, and you may have heard it last year as well, for some reason we have a home that has separation anxiety. So this year, the heat pump went up the day before we left. So we're scrambling to get the heat pump in, and I want you to know that she bravely led the effort to get that heat pump in while I was running all over the place. So anyway, thanks to her, thanks to everybody coming here right now. I want this today to be a personal history. I want to talk a little bit about how I came to be involved with some of the actions that CIA had in Vietnam, and some of my friends who were involved with that. Now, see that handsome young man up there? There's the real badge picture, I'm sorry to report. Circa maybe early 1990s. You'll note what a handsome, thin young man that is as well, with ever so slightly more hair than I have right now. I was really a child of the 70s and 80s. By the time Vietnam arrived in my life, it was pretty much gone. I went to college with kids who'd served in Vietnam, but I was the younger one. By the time I arrived at the agency, Vietnam was, well, it was the old guys. And I didn't care about that. I was worried about Russians. I was worried about the wall falling. I was worried about the end of history and all that other kind of good stuff that drives 34-year-old kids. I used to see guys like this wandering around the hallways with those Gayabara shirts on, those light slacks, and we used to sneer underneath our breath. They were EA guys. East Asia Division guys, Vietnam guys. Another time, another place. Little did I realize about 20 years later how I would discover the comfort of those shirts, but nevertheless, at the time, they seemed old-fashioned, out of place, and who were these guys? Here's what I remember about Vietnam. I had a friend of mine who was actually at the embassy, one of the last guys out on that helicopter, desperately trying to get Vietnamese who had served and worked with CIA out. We were somewhat successful, and not all the way. And when you talk to those old EA guys, it still hurt. Because remember, in my mind, while it was 1,000 years ago, I was there in 1984, and they're talking about 1975, which as an adult doesn't sound like very much. In those days, it did. They were involved in the agency in getting families out, or at least family members out. Some adopted kids. Some worked hard to get people who had worked with the agency out. It wasn't always easy. Make no mistake about it, Hanoi was vicious after the war. About 1 million people ended up in re-education camps. And frankly, there were probably about 100,000 to 200,000 who were simply slaughtered. We lost that war. We lost a lot of people in that war. And a lot of Vietnamese were killed after that war because we lost. That's a price that we may carry and we tend to forget about. But the people who I lived at that point in time did not. And of course, by the time I arrived in Washington in 1983, this gash had been dug into the earth. I hate and love this memorial. I hate it because it reminds me of the defeat of our country and the thousands of men who were wasted. And I love it because what I would love to do is every time some idiot on Capitol Hill, not that there are any up there, Or some presidential candidate who, lives in splendor in New York or elsewhere, starts talking about sending our troops into the field. I want them to stand in the gully there and read those names aloud. And remember what the price is when you don't have a goal and you don't know what you're doing and you get cowardly and you pull out. People pay a price. See, honey, sometimes people do applaud for me. Mrs. Marks will present the opposing viewpoint here momentarily. This guy, Robert Gates, when I left the operations directorate after I had won the Cold War in 1990, I had to find a place to go. Now, I had worked as a lobbyist and had run issues on Capitol Hill, so I had some experience with Capitol Hill. And by the way, before you sneer about lobbyists, remember the difference between a good lobbyist and a bad lobbyist is one who's successful for you. So I was asked to go to congressional affairs. I was asked, because of my background in the operations directorate, to serve as one of 3 Senate liaisons to Capitol Hill. For the most part, I would focus on DO activities, operational activities overseas, spying, covert action, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I came in trying to get this man into office in 1991. Bob Gates had failed, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates now. Bob Gates had been deputy director at CIA and had been involved in Iran-Contra. He claimed he hadn't, but on the other hand, his door was right next door to the director of Central Intelligence, Bill Casey, and he could actually have leaned against his door and listened to what was going on. That was 1987. The Bush administration, 1999, decided to put him up again. It was a fight. The only thing that saved him at the time was there was another fight with Clarence Thomas. And that took precedent. But in the middle of all that, when I was acting as a bright little 34-year-old congressional guy, counting votes, and by the way, we were behind 8-7 on the committee at that point, midway through, Bob Gates wanted to quit. Everything was miserable. We were having these big hearings. Ever see the hearing room for the United States Senate, all that big white marble? That's where we were for weeks on end. There was a little room behind that, and that's where all of us hung out. And there was one person who also hung out in that room that no one trusted. And no one trusted him because he was a press person. I'll still remember the warning from my boss at the time, be careful, he's from the press. And his name was Arnaud de Bourchgrave. Some of you might know him as the author of The Spike. I knew him as a friend for 26 years. He passed away last year, and I miss him deeply. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we shared over the years. But Arnaud was there. And while I was being very wary about Arnaud and running around and talking one afternoon, as I was sitting there dealing with Bob Gates, who hates Capitol Hill, by the way, with a royal passion. Ever take a 4-year-old to the dentist? Well, try taking a potential DCI candidate to Capitol Hill who thinks Congress is a bunch of fools. They may be a bunch of fools, but they got your position and they got money, so you gotta love them one way or another. But Bob just couldn't do it. And it is Bob, by the way. I still see him once in a while, still talk to his wife Becky, etc. Bob just hated it and would sit in the corner and fuss, and he fumed, and he was difficult to deal with. So there's Arnaud sitting over in the corner, about right out of there. And I'm talking to Gates, and suddenly out of the corner of my ear I hear, "And when I parachuted into Dien Bien Phu." And I thought to myself, well, I can't do anything with him, but this sounds interesting. Arnaud, as a reporter for Newsweek, had parachuted into Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. Now, for those of you who don't know a lot about this history of time, this is another fine example of the French leading their way to defeat in another country. When the last battle you won is Austerlitz in 1813, 1812, your track record's not good. And I'll show you in a second how bad that track record is. So here's what Arnaud did. He went into a place that was surrounded by the Viet Minh. So who are these guys, the Viet Minh? Well, let me tell you something. They came out of World War II. They came out of World War II because in World War II, and this map's from 1940, by the way, when the Japanese took over this area, and by the way, the Japanese were brutal. Say what you will about what we just experienced in Vietnam, but there's a whole bunch of Japanese war memorials throughout East Asia. There are not a lot of American war memorials. One of the areas that they took, by the way, was North Vietnam, northern Indochina, directly. And they were very brutal up there, because that was, in their minds, the capital, an area next to China that they would use as a base to take over parts of China, as you can see. The South was Vichy French and relatively untouched. 1945, after the war, the French wanted Indochina back, and they came back with a vengeance. And guess who greeted them? The people who had been fighting the Japanese. You want to guess who that guy is the arrow's pointing to in the bad shorts? Ho Chi Minh, you bet. I'm going to give you a guess as to which government helped support Ho Chi Minh during the war. United States, you bet. I knew people, one of whom Hugh Montgomery from the Office of Strategic Services. He was still alive at age 94, Ambassador Hugh Montgomery. He goes on and on. Who went in there and worked with Ho Chi Minh to undermine the Japanese. He viewed Ho Chi Minh as a nationalist. He made no mistake about it. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, but somebody with whom we could deal. And some of those people you see standing around Ho Chi Minh are people in 1946 from the Office of Strategic Services, which became CIA, trying to work with Ho Chi Minh. Oh yeah, by the way, just for the record, couldn't resist. This is what the French did to themselves by 1954. You notice brilliantly and strategically they had pulled back the Dien Bien Phu, which was slightly surrounded. That, by the way, if you want to know what guts is what Arnaud dropped into in the middle of. And he was one of the guys who was marched out of there by the Viet Minh. We had a different foreign policy in those days. We had two brothers. Allen Dulles on the one side, John Foster on the other, two grim Presbyterians, speaking as one. By the way, their sister Eleanor, fascinating story about her if you have a good chance to read. Great book about the Dulleses. Several great books. Allen was the head of CIA. John Foster was the head of State Department in the Eisenhower administration, both strong anti-communists. The French eventually lost that war. A settlement was made in Geneva in 1954, which created a map of Vietnam, which I think a fair portion of us in this room recognize. It was divided north and south. Ho Chi Minh and the communist government had the north. We had the south. And we, in essence, had to set up governments very quickly in the South because Ho took over in the North, and by the way, made no beans about the fact that he wanted the South combined together in one Vietnam. We supported a series of governments in Vietnam. Diem is the name you might remember. My favorite picture, Lyndon Johnson walking a woman by the name of Madame New down the stairs, one of the most tough ladies that Southeast Asia ever put out. I'll talk about Madame Chiang Kai-shek in a little bit, by the way. I got to know her just a tad. I have a friend of mine who actually used to deal with Madame New, and I use that term loosely. You did not deal with Madame New. You simply tried to stand on top and guide her. Eventually, those people she was involved in were overturned in a coup in 1963, November of 1963, as you might remember, just before John Kennedy was killed. Perhaps at the instigation of State Department, not CIA, by the way. Henry Cabot Lodge made it clear that we were unhappy, our ambassador there, and that the president was unhappy with the current government. Unfortunately, sometimes in the business, when you light a fuse, the rocket goes off, and you can't control the rocket, and that was the case. Those guys were killed. We set up a series of governments afterwards. It's in the bottom right-hand corner. Key to others who proceeded in the government there is General Westmoreland. There were constant problems in the South. The South was not an organized place. It was split between Buddhist and Catholic. The original regime and some of the other ones following tended to favor the Catholics. The Buddhists, as you see, took some form of, well, pretty violent, but in their minds, passive action. It was a mess in the South. We never had a stable government in the South, although we kept on trying. Arnaud knew Graham Greene, and we talked a lot about Graham Greene. Graham Greene hated Americans. If you read The Quiet American, it is essentially about Americans coming into Southeast Asia and trying to work their anti-communist policy. He was quite dismissive of this. Edward Lansdale on the right is who he based that book on, one of the original warriors in there. He has a military uniform on, but he was working with Dulles and others to try to present a Western-type government in Vietnam, an alternative to the communists. It was, to say the least, a difficult road. And oh yeah, Jim Thompson? Anybody make it to Jim Thompson's in Thailand? The most profitable, successful CIA proprietary ever. Jim Thompson was an agency guy, he was an OSS guy. And he continued to work with the agency afterwards. Oh yeah, by the way, the ambassador to Thailand in the early 1950s was a fellow by the name of Bill Donovan, the head of Office Strategic Services. Eisenhower put him out there for a reason, to keep an eye on what was going in Vietnam. He was probably killed going up into Laos, because Laos was one of the first areas that North Vietnam pushed at in the early 60s, to see if they could begin to probe and find a way to take over, or at least to make communist Southeast Asia. We started off military advice back in the 1950s. Yeah, I know it says 1959 for the MAG. I assure you that was not the case. Both from CIA standpoint and the US military standpoint, we were beginning to train the South Vietnamese Army, which was, to say the least, an agglomeration of different kinds of police units, experienced, inexperienced, based on French background, based on our training, etc. It was a loose group. You might remember some of this. That's the Continental in beautiful downtown Saigon. I had lunch there the other day just to remind myself. I was there about 20 years ago. It was the place where the spies used to hang out. It was also the place, and I just put this in there, where they used to have the 5 o'clock follies on Friday. This is where the press got briefed by the military community of the United States, the MAG and others, MAG-V. That briefings were where the military earned a reputation that was not too good at the time. Basically, it was body count alley. So one of my friends had said, actually our nose said it, every week we piled up the bodies, and every week they kept on going. Every time you hear, by the way, someone talk about killing off the latest leader in ISIS, the latest leader in Al-Qaeda, and whatever else, well, it has an ancient history in our country. And you gotta be careful, because it's really easy to pile up bodies. It's not really easy to break ideologies or break the backs of organizations. I took this picture the other day. This is the top of the Caravel Hotel. This is where the reporters and CIA used to hang out together. And I took that picture because in my own dreams someday, perhaps in another place and another time, I will be able to sit with Arnaud and talk about what happened below him in that square. By the way, our favorite drink was bullshots. Highly recommended, by the way. Vodka, little bit of bouillon, little bit of Worcestershire sauce, etc. By the third one, you can solve all the problems in the world. There was a split in the early 60s, and you may remember that President Kennedy was interviewed in July of 1963 by Walter Cronkite. And his line was that the Vietnamese essentially had to fight their war. We could not do that for him. That is because Dulles, after the Bay of Pigs, was tossed out. Admiral Rayburn was brought in, the Kennedy man. Rayburn was highly skeptical of our capabilities in Vietnam and let Kennedy know it, in no uncertain terms. Johnson hated Rayburn's guts because he was a Kennedy guy and because, frankly, he had been an admiral and he didn't take a lot of bull out of anybody. By the way, get Hugh Shelton fired up and see what a 4-star does. That document, and forgive me because it's a little unclear, is a special national intelligence estimate. The intelligence community, the CIA, does not only do clandestine collection of human intelligence, it also has the largest collection of PhDs in the world, located within one building. Now, I grant you most of them, to put it politely, are introverts. The old joke was you could tell a difference between an introverted analyst and an extroverted analyst. The extroverted one was the one who stared at your shoes while he was talking to you. But they were brilliant and they were sharp, and the Southeast Asia group in particular was headed by someone by the name of Sam Adams, Samuel Adams, yes, related to the Adamses of Massachusetts. One of my buddies was his deputy branch chief, Charlie Turgeon. One of the analysts in that branch, by the way, was Bob Gates. And they came up with an estimate in 1964, and when Rayburn left in 1965, he dropped this on Johnson's desk. And here was the estimate. For the United States to win in Vietnam, it would take 1 million troops to commit for 10 years. 10-to-1 ratio. I love that kind of analysis, by the way. See, I'm the kind of guy who has to hire analysts. I don't like people who tell me what the color of the water is while I'm drowning. I like people to tell me how to get out of that water. I've heard a little bit of that recently. There are all kinds of problems in the world. We're all going to die. No, we're not. We're going to stumble, but we'll get out of it. What this document was about was a warning. Don't go in deep to Vietnam. Joint Chiefs, Lyndon Johnson decided they're going to go the other way. But Johnson had this thing in the back of his head till the day he left, and if you ever have a chance to read his biography, which I think is Vantage Point, take a look. He makes veiled references to it. He knew how impossible this was going to be. On the other hand, CIA does what it's told to do by the president because it reports directly to the president of the United States. It was asked to put together a covert action program to deal with the challenges of Vietnam. It was headed up by William Colby. That's the gentleman who's holding the rifle there. William Colby had been the Office of Strategic Services, an attorney by background. He'd been the head, or was about to become the head of the Operations Directorate. He became Chief of Station in Saigon, running the largest unit of CIA people in the world and in history up until we became involved in Baghdad in 2004. His job was twofold. One was to collect information through a series of spies throughout the country, to quote-unquote run those spies, run them also, by the way, into North Vietnam so we could find out what was going on in Hanoi, track down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, help direct other military activities as they could, and also engage in something called pacification. Remember, Vietnam War was split. It was not only the North Vietnamese army you were worried about, but the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were an indigenous group in the South, communists, excuse me, who were engaging in guerrilla-like activities against us. They were swimming in the population, if I can quote Mao, and the trick was to find them, and CIA's job in Operation Phoenix was to do just that. To find these people, to help the Vietnamese find these people, and the term of art was to neutralize them. Neutralization took place in a lot of ways. By order of the President of the United States, a finding, a legal finding, must be made before you can engage in a covert action program. Now, I know that sounds like legal mumbo-jumbo, but it is. It's the President of the United States saying, all right, here, boys, here's what you can do. And one of the things that President Johnson wanted CIA to do was kill people who opposed us in Vietnam, and that meant rounding up people. And if you think waterboarding was bad, guess what, guys? They used to throw these guys out of helicopters if they didn't tell the information that they wanted. By the way, from a personal standpoint, I do not believe torture works. I really don't. Never mind the morality of it. I'll set that aside, if you can, set that aside for a minute. Here's what torture gets you. Torture gets you people telling you what you want to hear, fast. Now, you may do it over time, and you may break some people down, et cetera, but I've seen too many studies out of Israel, out of the UK, and other places that indicates that what you get is garbage. Nevertheless, we were assigned by the president to neutralize the Viet Cong, to pull people into villages and safeguard them, train the Vietnamese to get out into the countryside and find out what was going on, and we did so. We also operated something called Air America. It's a lovely plaque inside the agency building there. It's a tribute to those pilots who essentially ran things into Laos for the most part. Cambodia was relatively neutral. Supplies to the local Laos who were fighting a quiet war against North Vietnam that wasn't talked much about, but was going on a daily basis. To help the Hmong tribesmen, eventually, by the way, resettled in Minnesota, thanks to CIA and other places in America. Sadly, we also got involved in other things that became more painful as time went along. We basically were able to direct the military to those pathways that were used in the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail. There was no such thing as a trail, by the way. It was a series of small trails through the middle of the jungle. Anybody here take one of the little tours where you went through the jungle? Can you imagine for a moment what it's like to fight in that? Can you imagine for a moment what it's like if someone is hauling stuff through that, literally with mules and on their back? Thousands and thousands of people. The purpose of the Agent Orange was essentially to break open those trails, to see where they were. No one had an idea of what this was to be in terms of death and destruction. In 1995, I went to an orphanage in Hanoi. The birth defects up there are still shocking. But as I said, no one knew. And if you fly over this territory, by the way, most of those areas that got Agent Oranged are still just gnarled trees and parts of jungle. There was also some controversy over something called Yellow Rain. This was a KGB attempt to blacken CIA's name during this period. Because remember something, the Russians were still there. The Russians had several thousand people in North Vietnam. The Chinese, by virtue of rumor and elsewise, may have had up to 300,000 people supporting the North Vietnamese. It's like Korea, for those of you who remember that. Russians put out the rumor that the CIA had put out so-called Yellow Rain, a type of poison chemical weapon to kill local tribesmen who were opposed to us. That was a lie. It's been proven to be a lie, but it was something that came out of that period, and my good friend Arnaud had reported on it and actually did a pretty good job of breaking the story as to why it was a KGB plant. A lie. Remember that next time you hear Putin, by the way. The KGB man at heart, a liar at heart, a killer at heart. This is the kind of thing that they promulgate. Another part of my life under Bob Gates, oh, he won, by the way, finally, 11-5. I got a couple of awards out of that, and I got the honor and the glory for a year and a half of carrying him down to Capitol Hill and listening to him crank every step of the way. He used to bring a book with him, by the way, and read, because he just hated the idea of being with these guys, and he'd only put it down when they would come in the room. It's great stuff. The issue was POWMIA. I must admit, until 1991, I knew nothing about it. I'd heard about it. What I had heard about it was about this fellow, Bobby Garwood. Bobby Garwood was an American soldier who deserted in South Vietnam. You'll notice the North Vietnamese prison camps listed here, the official camps that we knew about. Bobby Garwood claimed that there were others. Now, he probably did this because he was a deserter and was trying to bail himself out, but he brought back one map, and this is not the map. I just couldn't find the map. But it looked like this, claiming that there were prisoners being held in South and North Vietnam that we did not know about after the war. Now, I must admit, Defense Department didn't do a great job reacting to this one. Part of it was because they came out of a war they lost. Part of it was because something, and I want to tell you this, and please forgive me, because I know this sounds cruel and crude. Donald Trump, hate to mention that name, Donald Trump said something about John McCain. And you remember what he said about John McCain. All right? Among some military men, there is a belief that if you are a prisoner of war, you have failed in your duty, that your job is to die for your country. Now, there's an element of that was going on here that didn't exactly lend itself, that and bureaucratic lethargy, to finding out what was going on. So you want to know what we ended up with? Bad Rambo movies. But this captured the eye and the spirit of the country. Ann Mills Griffith, a name you might not know, but Ann led the POW families, a powerful force, both in the public and on Capitol Hill, demanding to know where our prisoners were. There were 2,100, 1,600, 1,800, depending upon what you wanted to count, prisoners at the end of the Vietnam War or missing in action. A committee was finally set up on Capitol Hill, chaired by John Kerry, who tried to hire me for the job, and John McCain, who tried to hire me for a staff director job up there on that committee. I would have sooner stuck my finger in a wetted light socket at that time. because it was a miserable experience. There were a lot of people who think the government had just lied to them about this and had not followed up enough. So 2 reasonable bona fide heroes of Vietnam. Yeah, that's right, I'm not voting for Trump anytime soon. 2 bona fide heroes of Vietnam, and yes, I know John Kerry and all the rest with the medal and all the rest of it. I spent a lot of time with him. He's a good man, tries hard, believed in what he did. Finally came up with the idea of setting up a joint POW-MIA account. This, by the way, was not just for Vietnam, but for all wars. All wars we'd fought in. There are still 80,000 people missing from World War II, mostly in the Pacific. There are 8,000 people missing in Korea from the Korean War. I used to go up to the Korean border. If I was going to stay on this trip, I would tell you a little bit more about that, collecting remains from the North Koreans. And 2,100 in Vietnam. Stony Beach was the name of the program set up in Bangkok to help supply and push our guys into the field, with the permission, by the way, of the Vietnamese, to go anywhere possible where we had intelligence, we CIA or others, that there might have been a body, an American remain left behind. I went up to one of these hills. It was about 25 miles outside of Da Nang. It was on a hill about like that, and guys were digging just like this. About 1,500 feet in the side of a mountain. See, here's the thing, guys. This is not a John Wayne movie. When an airplane goes into a mountain at 400 miles an hour, people disappear. Things crush. What we did find on a site similar to this was, in fact, a Navy ring and a couple of pieces of airplane. Oftentimes, the local natives would take away the materials because they were valuable to them. A lot of times, the Vietnamese were being chary about these locations, in part because the Vietnamese felt embarrassed by the fact that about 1/3 of those guys, 1/3 of that 1,800, were killed on the ground by local natives. Make no mistake about it, when those guys came down, they were under fire. And in spite of orders from Hanoi to capture and bring them back, more often than not, local militias tried to kill them. We take those remains and we bring them back. Dickham Air Force Base, and I have been there during these ceremonies. I have been there when they have put stuff in boxes. And I mean stuff because you can't recognize some of it. Pieces of bone, perhaps. Little bits of metal. It's brought back to Sil High Lab. It is essentially the identification lab. Whatever is found is identified through painstaking work, checked with DNA databases in the last 10 years to identify who those remains are. I have seen remains identified from plane crashes in 1954 in the Himalayas to guys who augured in 1972 in an F-4. They do brilliant work, and when it is all said and done, we leave no one behind, and we make sure that they are given their proper respect and burial wherever they are. Anybody who ever tells you that we leave people behind is full of crap, and you can quote me on it, and I'll find the son of a gun and I'll beat him up for you. It's a lie, a lie, a lie, a lie. Now let me tell you another great patriot I had the honor of working for, and I don't say that lightly, because when I look at the current presidential candidates, I start to cry. Because here's a guy I worked for a few years, Robert Joseph Dole. I just saw him, maybe about, what was it, Sue, a couple months ago? Something like that. I went back to the office. He's 91 years old, feisty as hell, got a lousy back like I do, so we're exchanging doctors. Sharp as a tack. I can only give you a brief statement about what he thinks of the current level of candidates. I'll spare you that obscenity. He doesn't swear that often. Bob Dole was Senate Majority Leader when I went to work for him. I oversaw all his work on intelligence, and I saw all of his work on POW-MIA issues, which meant when we went toward recognition in 1995, I suddenly found myself at the Metropole Hotel in Hanoi. Why? Because A, we were running for election, and B, we were suspicious and were worried that the Clinton administration was so hell-bent for leather to get recognition that they would ignore the POW-MIA issue. So yours truly had 4th of July dinner in Hanoi in July 4, 1995. That was a surreal experience, let me tell you. The next day, I got to go to the president's palace, along with a couple of other senators and congressmen, to talk about some of these issues and demand to make sure that we had, well, as much as I could demand. Remember something. Always watch little Senate and House staffers and guys on the Hill who start talking about my senator and my congressman. You're a reflection of their power. And a lot of guys forget that. And they think they are the power. Dangerous are the princes. Watch them. During a dinner with the president of Vietnam, Senator Harkins, Senator Lautenberg, and others, I had a chance to meet this man. Anybody know who that is? General Giap. General Giap, then in his early 80s, a man who defeated both the French as well as the Americans, stood about yay high. And I'll tell you something, I have never looked in the eyes of someone who had more depth and power, with one exception, and that was a woman by the name of Madame Chiang Kai-shek, who I'd met a couple years before that. I'd sponsored a party for her up on Capitol Hill. You want to know what bullets look like? You want to know what laser beams look like? That old boy had them. And he came over without any teeth in his mouth, shook my hand, and said, "Please say hello to Senator Dole." I'm not so sure how much more he knew in English than that, but he did. And there he is in his prime. Very soon after I got back to Washington and I briefed Senator Dole, everybody agreed that essentially we were going to be okay on the POW-MIA issue. President Clinton recognized Vietnam. Congress approved. And we had, as you might guess, some extended military contacts with them, as well as diplomatic contacts. You want to guess who's on the right-hand side of that picture? Yep, Hugh Shelton, you bet. I bet he has some interesting stories to say about that. Oh yeah, by the way, sometime in May or early June, our president is going to take a swing through here. And he will stop in Hanoi on the anniversary of the 21st year recognition. He's missing it just a little bit. I want to leave this story on a happy note, because Arnaud and I used to talk about Vietnam a lot, and where it was and where it was going. He'd been back a few times. He was more interested in the Middle East than he was in Vietnam at that point, for all the reasons you might guess. He was a reporter by background. When he and I used to appear on television once in a while together, we get to talk about the Middle East. But a lot of times the conversation would go back to how Americans handled Vietnam and what it meant, and what it means to make a commitment of men and women and personnel and treasure to a given effort. We were optimistic about the kids. It's a young country. I hope you saw that when you were walking around. You got a chance to go to the schools, you got a chance to go to some of these other places. It's a young country. Most of these kids have been born, fair portion of the population, 60%, have been born since 1975. A friend of mine who was the intelligence officer in charge of East Asia still thinks that Vietnam will become the greatest powerhouse here because of those young people. Yeah, I know it's a little rural. Yeah, I understand that the infrastructure is a little bit weak here and there. By the way, I was told that in Hanoi, and I have no statistics for the rest of the country, but in Hanoi, the two leading cause of death among young men, you hear where I'm going here, between the ages of 25 and 40, is A, motorcycles, as you might imagine. They have a Buddhist-like faith in their ability, as you know, to circle through these grand circles and move around, etc. For any of you, by the way, so do the Chinese. For those of us who crossed the street in Xiamen the other day, what a great religious experience that was. I am going to church next week, thank you very much. And the other thing is, by the way, they have a tendency to want to string power into their homes. So it's a consequence when you act as your own electrician. Sometimes things don't work out well. In fact, if I can continue for just one brief moment on my anti-Trump rant for just one moment, I would like to walk up to Donald Trump someday and say, you know, I'm a pretty good plumber. I'm going to do all of your plumbing for all your hotels. I'm a good plumber. I'm very good at it. I know exactly what I'm doing. Absolutely. The same way I want you to take over a $4 trillion enterprise with 500 ICBM missiles. Don't think so. But hey, listen, that's my personal prejudice. It's a modern country, and it's modernized quickly. Saigon, I got to tell you something, it was 20 years since I've been to Saigon, and I was stunned. It was growing then, but did you see those buildings? And did you see how they were building, how fast they were building? And cross your fingers about how fast they're building. Sometimes it doesn't always get done quite right, but it's moving very, very quickly in ways we couldn't have imagined. There's still some residue. Who here went to Hanoi? See this? This is on the lake where John McCain got shot down. I couldn't find a darn picture at home. I've got a picture of myself standing right in front of this thing, and I got another picture of John McCain standing in front of this thing. He got shot down on the lake. There's a great diaspora of Vietnamese in the United States, elsewhere, but in the United States, Australia, another place. But those people are now interacting with their country. This is no longer a case of South Vietnamese who've come to live in America. These are Vietnamese Americans who view Vietnam as a great place to be. It's a tough neighborhood, guys. You know, we've been sailing up through all the middle of this. There are a lot of countries here with a lot of claims to the South China Sea. Why? Well, there's oil in them there hills. There's minerals in them there hills. There's fishing in them there hills. And everybody wants a piece of the action. And oh yeah, by the way, guess who really wants a piece of the action? This map comes to me by virtue of someone whom I work with at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. I am on an advisory group there. Actually, I'm on one of the boards there that looks at transnational issues. This was a map given to me by someone who just got back from China. This is the kind of map that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, this is the kind of map that the military thinks about when they think about China. China feels it has a claim to the South China Sea. You'll notice, by the way, that Taiwan is now included in this, maybe a little bit hard to see there. They want Taiwan back. Make no mistake about it. Now, I am not paranoid, and I am not a China hugger, or a panda hugger rather, and I am not a panda grinder, whatever the opposite is. Okay, we're going to have to deal with China as we've dealt with other things in the past, and we'll deal with them, and they'll be more powerful than they were, et cetera, et cetera. But just know in the back of your head what it is that they want. They want to reclaim land that they owned once upon a time because they're looking to restore themselves. Where we visited the other day, Amoy was one of the Xiamen, Amoy, a colonial name. The same way with Hong Kong was forced upon them. I didn't flash a map of China up here because you don't need another lecture on China, but China was humiliated and they're coming back. There are reasons for these islands that are creating. Do they look like aircraft carriers to you? You bet they are. They intend to extend their control in this area. I asked another acquaintance of mine, Greg Treverton. Greg is the chairman of the National Intelligence Council for the American intelligence community. What that is a gathering of all the wizards who think great thoughts about different issues. And I said to Greg, what in the world are the Chinese doing down there? And Greg's response is, I don't know. We think it's a dumb move. Don't understand why they would want to do it. Except if they're looking to just push and push and push. Like a teenager. Push and push and push wherever they can. So let me leave you on an optimistic note. Looking down at the central square in Saigon, look at that prosperity, look at that beauty. That was a place of war, that was a place of destruction. These are the people who live there now. Vietnam will be a great place to come. It will have to deal with China. It has come to us, by the way, to help deal with China. And I think that relationship will go on for some period of time. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is 17 minutes after the hour. At 2:30, the Zumbaites will begin to come to the back of the room. Now, for those of you who've seen the movie Zulu, you'll remember that the sword essentially bounced off the shield. The Zumbaites have their yoga pads, and they will bounce off the shields. So I will cede to the Zumbaites as best I can. But what I will ask you in the meantime, can we turn up the house lights a little bit, please? This is an opportunity, if you so desire, to ask me any question you like. I am more than happy to entertain any question. Alan, give me about 1 second. I'm more than happy to entertain any question, and of course, in the finest Washington tradition, I will answer the question that I wish to answer. You don't think you're going to get the truth out of a CIA guy, are you? I mean, come on. Sir, you shouted first. You know, it's funny. I have a friend of mine who works for John Kasich and loves John Kasich because he thinks he's a bright guy. He's a governor, has served in Washington, D.C. Here's your problem with dealing with Washington when you're in that position. Now, I got to know the George W. administration reasonably well. I sort of know the Obama guys reasonably well in the White House. Well, at least enough that I can get a free meal in the room there once in a while. Here's your problem. When a guy walks in there who hasn't had legislative experience, or a guy walks in there who hasn't had to deal with a legislature and do the mucky things that you have to do for budgets, and deal with the bureaucracy, and deal with sort of running with an opposition, like in the House or the state rep's office or the state senate and that kind of stuff, it's hard. Because especially if you put like a business executive in, they think they're in charge. So they think they can sit there and order somebody to do something. I think President Obama is just amazing sometimes. I think he came in there thinking he hated the Senate, by the way. He came in there, he was going to tell these guys what to do. Here's your problem. That Constitution I flashed up the other day has 3 equal branches of government. And we may think that 90% of the Congress is a bunch of bozos. That's a prominent number. Here's your problem. 90% of them are reelected every 2 years. So maybe the other guys are bozos, but not your guy. So if you think you're getting rid of the legislative branch or can overwhelm it, et cetera, you can't. You have to learn how to work them. You also have to learn how to work with a $4 trillion bureaucracy with 3 million people in it. 3.5 or 4 total. The only thing bigger than the United States government bureaucracy is the People's Liberation Army of China and the Indian railway system. Listen, you got full employment and $1.4 billion, you got to do something with it. So when you ask to turn the keys over to this Lamborghini, you sort of want to have something beside a 16-year-old who just learned how to do a stick shift. So long-winded answer, as you'll note, is I didn't exactly answer your question because I don't know what to do now, because Kasich ain't going to get it unless they go to a brokered convention. All right, see another question? Sir. Bergdahl's situation was very difficult, in part because I think the kid was really not stable. And if you listen to the lawyer, it was pretty clear. And the lawyer is actually someone I think Suzanne is at least familiar with or knows a little bit about this. When you have a young person like that who is mentally unstable, and they have done something horrific like this, when they've deserted, and they've gone off on their own and they've come back, you really do have to engage in some form of justice. But I still think you sort of have to use your brains with this one too, which is, I really feel sorry for his family. I feel frankly sorry for him. I don't think he was in his right mind. And I think you have to take that into consideration and accordingly. We're a just society, and I hope when it's all said and done that that's the record that's left behind. We can't let people know that they can just wander off. But on the flip side of it, this kid was not a well man. I agree. I couldn't agree with you more. I think he was a nutcase. I think he cost us a lot of money. I think he was a guy like Bobby Garwood, who frankly was looking to make an excuse for what he did. But I also think he's sick in the head. And I don't know what to do about that one, frankly. Bad cases make bad law. This is a good example of it, except to simply try to punish him as best you can and take into consideration the fact that this is not a well guy. And remember that this is not a rule that we can apply to everybody in the future. Sir. If you listen to the people at hand, there's a split here, and because all experts split, in case you haven't noticed here in the last week or two. They also all tell you bad news because nobody makes money off of the good news. Sorry guys, I hire a lot of these guys, so it's hard sometimes to beat them to the point where I can get a decision out of them. I would say the cyber business is hard because the cyber thing was never built to do what it's doing. It was never built to be secure. It actually was built in government installations, which were secure. I got to know a guy by the name of Vint Cerf. Now, Vint's uncle, you might remember Bennett Cerf. Okay, well, Vint was one of the guys, he works at Google now. Vint was one of like a half a dozen guys who decided that they had all this computer information at Stanford and UCLA and Oak Ridge and Brookhaven Labs in New York, and they had to talk to each other. And it was, by the way, it was about nuclear tests and nuclear weapons. So they built this thing to sort of share this stuff back and forth. It was never meant to do the secure things that it is doing. Security has been retrofitted to it, and as a consequence, and frankly, some of the security that has been offered has been, to put it politely, less than adequate. I have never seen more con artists in one business, and trust me, I'm a professional con artist. That's what I was trained to do, than I have in the software security business. So we are vulnerable. The government has been reluctant to set standards. Part of it is because Silicon Valley has pushed back very hard. They have a lot of money. They're very arrogant, as most people with a lot of money, young, are. They're beginning to learn their lessons, but it has left us vulnerable, and we know it. And the practice that I've started to preach personally has been one of what I call resilience, which is you can't stop all this stuff from happening. You just can't. There's no such thing as 100% security. Just isn't. You can put all the locks on the door you want. You can put all the machine guns outside your house you want. If somebody wants to break in, they can break in. You want me to get information out of the most secure place in the world? Give me an unhappy 22-year-old male, like Snowden, who had a bad relationship with his father and who felt he was being ignored. And he felt as though he was smarter than his other people. Oh, I'd like to recruit those people. Please give me those people. Give me anything. Long-winded answer is saying that we are vulnerable to that. Now, steps are being taken. This is not as though people aren't doing anything, but the problem ultimately lies in how much money you want to spend on security. Because you can bankrupt yourself if you want to. We could spend the entire gross national product of the United States on securing the internet, and it still wouldn't be secure. Why? Because I can find myself a nice 25-year-old angry kid who broke in with his job at NSA, the National Security Agency, supposedly the most secret agency in the United States. I love to kick him, by the way. It's sort of a rivalry thing. and he took out all the information that was available in a pot that had been gathered together so people could look at it and make better analytical judgments. A good reason to do it. They had security on it. The unfortunate part was he was the guard. So now what are you going to do? You put 2 guards on there? I mean, that's your choice. Is this going to be like a nuclear facility where you put 2 keys and go like this? So that's the problem when you start talking about that. We are vulnerable. I think security measures are being taken. We are nowhere near making those things 100% secure, just not. Now, with regards to the terrorism business, this is another case of granularity. 9/11 was an intelligence failure, pure and simple. But it wasn't because people were stupid. It was just simply because we weren't covering the areas we should have been covering to get the kind of information we needed to get to find out who these guys were and what they were going to do. Domestic and international weren't, FBI and CIA weren't talking to each other, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of that has been straightened out. Now your problem is this thing, this internet over which we can recruit people and talk to people. Remember what I talked about the other day? Well, if CIA can do it, guess who else can do it? And that's what's happening with ISIS. You have a lot of kids in their 20s who are either bored or displaced from their societies. You can have 1,000 kids who are bored and displaced from their society, and it may only take 1 or 2. How are you going to follow all of those people? Are you going to follow them all the time? NSA did. NSA was essentially buying, this is what was the objection from a lot of the people that Snowden sort of stirred up. And you heard it in Ted Cruz and others. NSA was buying essentially haystacks to find needles. They weren't recording your calls. What they were recording were the phone numbers that everybody called because you didn't know. who they were talking to. And by the way, how long they'd be talking to them. Maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. Who knows? Maybe you needed that information that long. So the stuff in San Bernardino, for instance, is a classic example. They had sort of popped up on scope. We were a little bit aware of them. But at the same time, what are you going to do until they do something? You're going to bust them preliminary? For what? They thought evil thoughts? They had guns? Ugh, good luck on that. We are very fortunate in the United States that we have not had the amount of alienated young Islamic men that they've had in Europe. I will say that. When you see Brussels, and you see Germany, and you see France, I want you to think about the South in the 1950s. I was a senior fellow. I'm now on the board of directors of the George Washington University Center for Cyber and Homeland Security. Got a lot of briefing from a lot of European guys. And when I listen to them talk, it sounds like Bull Connor about 1955 about that population. They're isolated. It's been hard to reach out to them. They have been radicalized. I am worried about Syria. I am worried about what it means when you can train people in an open space to blow people up. There are 800 to 1,000 of those guys who have gone south. And how are we going to attract all of them? Now, I can feel a wave of Zumba coming in my direction. I see the Zumba chief in charge out there. She is saluting me, and anybody who's that happy and smiles that much will be ready to attack momentarily, I assure you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for this. Really appreciate it. I hope I get to see you again.